Put me in your boarding school, make me learn your white man rule, be a fool.
Conflict over land ownership began in the early 1800s when European Americans and Native Americans both wanted the land that European Americans wanted to settle on. As an attempt to solve this conflict, compromises were made between the European Americans and the Native Americans over who got the land, but many of the compromises ended up failing. Around the same time that there was conflict over land, cultural conflict began to start. Schools were started, and Native Americans were sent there to be assimilated into European American culture. The schools were an attempted compromise to solve cultural conflict, but many of the schools proved to be ineffective. In 1956, the Indian Relocation Act was passed to try and solve cultural conflict once again. This attempted compromise worked significantly better, but American Indian boarding schools were not forgotten. Beginning in the early 1800s, European Americans were expanding westward across the United States to settle. However, Native Americans were already living there. This caused conflict over land ownership, and many Native Americans were forced out of their homes and killed. After that, European Americans pressured the Native Americans to compromise by signing treaties that gave up their land. In exchange for the land, goods and money were promised, but many of these compromises failed, and soon Native Americans had little to no land left. One promise in exchange for land that was always kept was the promise of a reservation. The reservations were small bits of land that Native Americans were given. The reservations were a place where they could live forever. But in many opinions, the reservations were unfair. Compared to the amount of land once owned by the Native Americans, they were small. They also had inadequate amounts of resources needed for Native Americans to thrive. Many European Americans thought that their culture was better than Native American culture, and thought that Native Americans should adopt their culture. Opinions like this caused cultural conflict because Native Americans did not want to give up their culture. In the mid-1800s, white churches and missionary groups began to open schools and churches on the reservations. Native American children attended the schools and were taught how to live like European Americans. They were taught the Christian religion and English language. But soon, European Americans supporting the schools decided the mission schools were not doing enough. European Americans thought that because the students were attending schools on reservations, they were not being fully assimilated and were still around their native culture. So a school was started by Richard H. Pratt in 1879 that was located off reservation in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Pratt gave a speech on the education of Native Americans in which he said that
General has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man.
After the first Indian boarding school was started, more and more were opened by the BIA and modeled off of Pratt's school. In 1881, 2 years after the first American Indian boarding school was built, Congress passed the Indian Appropriation Act. One of the Act's provisions required Indian parents to send their children to boarding schools, or they would have rations and annuities from treaty signings withheld. Children arrived at the schools and were immediately given new haircuts and clothing. They were also given new English names in place of their native names. The students were not allowed to speak their native language during the time that they were at the schools, despite many not being able to speak English. When we got talking, because we're not allowed to talk our tribal language, and then me and my cousin, we get together and we talk in Indian. We always hush up when we see a teacher or faculty coming, and then we always laughed and said, "I think they're trying to make little white boys out of us." The students were taught with a half-and-half curriculum, which meant that half their day was spent in the classroom learning English, reading, writing, spelling, math, and science. The other half of their day was spent doing manual labor. The girls did work such as cleaning, washing clothes, and cooking. The boys did work such as plowing fields, farming, building houses, and building furniture. The boys built most of the buildings on campus because the funding for many of the schools was low. As a result of refusal to complete tasks like these, students were severely punished. Many students remember being beaten or being locked up in dungeons or cells in basements for a long period of time, eating only bread and water. The conditions of the schools were not great. Many kids were housed in a small building, so any illness spread like wildfire. and a lot of the food was neither healthy nor in good quality. One girl says she remembers that now and then you find a little mouse in your milk pitcher, a little dead mouse, and in the hardtack crackers, if you crack them open, there'd be a few little worms in them. When the students returned to their families after years of assimilation at the boarding schools, many had mixed feelings. A lot of students never came home because they died at the schools from illness or abuse. But many students were happy to return to their family and culture after years of the opposite. Other students felt a little less excited to return. Many had forgotten both their native culture and religion at the schools, and returning to a place where they had to practice both felt uncomfortable to some. Bill Wright, a former student at the Indian boarding school in Nevada, said that,
"They're coming home, and then my grandma asked me to talk Indian to me, and I told her, Grandma, I don't understand you. She says, then who are you? I went, my name's Billy. She said, your name's not Billy. She said, your name is Tatum. That's who you are. That's your name. And I went, not what they told me.
Some students chose not to come home and instead got a job using the culture they had been assimilated into for the past few years. The vast majority of the schools stayed open through the early 1900s, and the government continued to send kids.
You put me in your boarding school, make me learn your white man rule, be a fool. Oh, 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 oh.
Then, in 1928, the Merriam Report was published. This report gave information about the poor health conditions and manual labor at the schools. After the publishing of the report, many changes were made to the conditions at the boarding schools, but many people were starting to realize that the boarding schools were not very effective, and the majority of the schools began to close. A few remained, but funding declined greatly. American Indian boarding schools attempted a compromise because European Americans believed that assimilating Native Americans into their culture would help them thrive. But many of the boarding schools were ineffective and did not culturally assimilate as hoped. So in 1956, Congress passed the Indian Relocation Act. This act promised money and jobs for Native Americans if and when they moved off of the reservations. Ray Marie Martinez was 8 years old when her family moved off their reservation in Washington State to California. She says that,
Mom and Dad felt that they were making the right choice and decision in being part of the relocation program because so much was promised to them.
after this act was passed, the number of Native Americans living in big cities increased greatly, but Native Americans were still discriminated against when trying to get jobs and making a living off the reservations. Many groups were formed like the American Indian Movement, or the AIM. These groups helped Native Americans that had moved off the reservations and started schools that honored both Native American culture and European American culture and taught Native Americans how to live in a society where they were discriminated against. Ramon Enriquez, head of the United American Indian Involvement Incorporation, says that
this is the face of American Indians today. We're living in the cities. We're living where the jobs are. We're living where the opportunities are.
the first main conflict involving European Americans and Native Americans was over land ownership in the early 1800s and the next almost immediately after that, if not during. The cultural conflict between European Americans and Native Americans resulted in attempted compromises that failed, like the boarding schools. Unlike the conflict over land ownership, cultural conflict lasted a very long time and is still going on today in the U.S. and across the world. The boarding schools were almost all ineffective, but they were very important and were not forgotten.